Welcome to Finding Medina. Episode 12, Is This the Battlefield of Medina? I'm Brandon Seale. In the summer of 1822, a group of San Antonians marched south out of town to greet the new governor of Texas. It should have been a festive occasion. This was the first governor to have been appointed by the newly independent Mexican government, free of Spanish control, a goal for which San Antonians had sacrificed so much. Yet as they crossed the Medina River and the South Texas prairie gave way to a live oak forest, half-buried, partial skeletons began to appear in the sandy soil, as if trying to dig their way out of their graves, sobering the mood of all present. Most of these dead, many of them family and friends of the San Antonians marching down the Laredo Road now, had in fact never known a grave, by the direct order of that same General Arredondo who had defeated them at the Battle of Medina, and who hoped that their corpses might serve as grim reminders of the cost of disloyalty. The irony, of course, was that by 1822, General Arredondo was technically aligned with the cause that his enemies had died to advance. He, along with many other Mexican royalists, had abandoned his loyalties to the Spanish king in 1821, when that king had been forced to accept an overly Republican constitution back in the home country. By pledging his allegiance instead to the emperor of a newly independent Mexico, Arredondo had been allowed to retain his position as military governor of the northeastern part of Mexico. In 1822, the new Mexican government decided to check his authority, however, through the appointment of a new civil governor. Unlike Arredondo, this new governor, José Félix Tres Palacios, boasted genuine rebel bona fides, having actively fought for Mexican independence since at least 1814, before it was cool to do so. He was no stranger to the War of Independence in Texas either, having been imprisoned at one point with some of Gutiérrez de Lara's accomplices, and later serving at the head of several uprisings in Texas and northeastern Mexico, which aimed at finishing what the Republican Army of the North had come so close to achieving in 1813. As Governor Tres Palacios marched to meet the San Antonians who had come out to welcome him, he was accompanied by an American Mexican, I suppose is the correct term, since he was in fact a resident of Mexican Texas and had been for some time. It was James Gaines, who you might recall from episode 4 as one of the earliest American converts to Gutiérrez de Lara's cause in 1811 back in Louisiana. Gaines rose to become one of Gutiérrez de Lara's most trusted captains, crossing the Sabine with him in August 1812, enduring the siege of Goliad that winter, riding in just before the Battle of Rosillo at the command of several hundred Native American allies, and traveling back to Louisiana to help counter José Álvarez de Toledo's smear campaign against Gutiérrez de Lara following the Battle of Alazan Creek. When Toledo succeeded in overthrowing Gutiérrez de Lara, however, Gaines saw little reason to return to the Republican Army, and so was spared the fate of his companions on August 18, 1813. Unlike Toledo, however, Gaines never gave up on Texas, and certainly never forgot about it. By 1819, he was back on the Texas side of the Sabine River, and would soon be elected alcalde of the Sabine district of Nacogdoches, and later sheriff of Nacogdoches under the new Mexican government. I'm not sure exactly how he and Tres Palacios knew each other, but it's clear that they ran in similar circles and shared similar ideals. Tres Palacios had asked Gaines to travel with him from the Altiplano of central Mexico up into San Antonio, perhaps just as a guide, but also perhaps because the new governor wanted his first official act to be a unifying, healing gesture, a nod toward the sacrifices of the past and the hopes of the new republic's future. To that end, he wanted representatives of San Antonio's community, as well as Gaines, to be with him for this great act. Here's Gaines describing what happened next in the third person. Quote, "At the lake, 6 miles from Medina, where the Patriots were defeated in 1813, Tres Palacios asked Captain Gaines if he would assist in doing honor to the bones of his brave countrymen. They fell, said Tres Palacios, in our cause, in defense of Mexican liberty and independence, and it is not right that their bones should lie thus unburied. End quote. Gaines demurred and suggested only that an Our Father be said. Once this was done, quote, Tres Palacios now gathered all the bones of the Americans, leaving those of the Gachupines, and forming his army in a solid square, he addressed them in a pathetic and patriotic speech laudatory of the Americans who fell there, and then buried them in one common grave on the battleground. It was the bones of the body only that were buried here. The skulls were taken on 6 miles further to Medina, where at the foot of a pecan tree, he buried them in the honors of war. End quote. To be accurate, it wasn't just the Americans that Tres Palacios was burying that day. It was all of the Republican dead. After 9 years decomposing in the Encinal de Medina, there would have been little way to distinguish Tejano, Native American, and American corpses. Though the skulls, according to Gaines, were buried under a pecan tree along the Medina, Jose Antonio Navarro tells us that the bodies were buried beneath an oak tree along the Laredo Road. And in marking this final resting place, Tejanos didn't miss the opportunity to slip in an anti-monarchical jab. They hung a sign on the oak tree, commemorating their fallen dead and comparing them to the Spartans at Thermopylae. Quote, Here lie the Mexican heroes who followed the example of Leonidas, who sacrificed their wealth and lives, ceaselessly fighting against tyrants. End quote. The experience of the previous decade had made most San Antonians, most Tejanos we should probably say, Republicans, or Federalists as they came to call themselves in the new Mexican Republic. By contrast, their opponents, many of them former Royalists, took on the Centralist label, supporting the creation of a powerful central Mexican state to replicate many of the features of the old Spanish government, just without the Spaniards. Centralism never really had much of a chance in remote frontier San Antonio, however, where support for more devolved local control was a relatively moderate position to a citizenry who had long suffered from central government neglect and who had long used the title Republicano as a title of respect. And yet Tejanos' sacrifices in the War of Mexican Independence went largely unheralded by the new Mexican Republic. Here's Navarro writing years later, quote, The noble citizens of Bexar sacrificed their lives and property, performing prodigies of valor in the year 1813. And yet they left to their descendants no other inheritance than the indifference and ingratitude of the Mexican Republic, end quote. It hurt Tejanos that their state wasn't accorded, quote, her rightful place alongside Guadalajara, Valladolid, Zacatecas, Oaxaca, Puebla, Veracruz, and others for her role in liberating her glorious patria, end quote. That's from the anonymous Republican Tejano account. And it hurt them that the deeds of the Republican Army of the North didn't rank alongside those of, quote, Morelos, Matamoros, Victoria, Bravo, Guerrero, end quote, in the traditional pantheon of Mexico's heroes of independence. And that, by the way, that's from Gutierrez de Lara's memoirs. At the root of this issue, I think, was the cold, hard fact that many at the center of power in Mexico inherited that old Spanish suspicion of Tejanos, of anyone, frankly, willing to live in such a distant and merciless place as Texas. To them, Tejanos' boldness in declaring their independence before the rest of Mexico, and the readiness with which they aligned themselves with Indios Bárbaros and with foreigners, gave their revolt a distinctly different flavor than the insurrections of Morelos, Matamoros, Victoria, Bravo, and Guerrero. To them, valorizing Tejanos' already pronounced independent streak threatened the fragile national identity that the new Mexican nation, fractured already by centuries of class and caste divisions, was so desperate to construct. Of course, this refusal to acknowledge what Tejanos suffered for Mexican independence only left Tejanos feeling doubly aggrieved by what they had endured in 1813. But when Mexico finally adopted a federalist, call it Republican Constitution in 1824, it was suddenly cause for real hope. No one embraced the possibilities of self-government more energetically than Tejanos. Go listen to my episode 12 of the first season of this podcast for details. And Tejanos' initial enthusiasm for the Mexican Constitution of 1824 is important in explaining the intensity of their reaction to its total repudiation in 1834. What made it worse was that they knew well the man who had just repudiated that Constitution and conferred all authority on himself. This man had visited San Antonio in 1813 as a young lieutenant in General Arredondo's army, where he was actually cited for bravery during the Battle of Medina. Antonio de Padua Maria Severino López de Santana y Pérez de Lebrón, or Santa Anna, as most of us know him, had learned from his experience in the Medina campaign to distrust the rebellious and independent citizenry of Texas. He had internalized well the lessons of his old one-eyed general. In particular, he had learned the effectiveness of brutality in, temporarily at least, subduing a population. Despite all that Tejanos had suffered from tyrants in 1813, however, they would be among the first to rise up in open revolt against the tyranny of 1834. When José Antonio Navarro resolved around that time that, quote, Texas, absolutely all of Texas, should first be reduced to ashes rather than live in slavery under a despotic government, end quote, he wasn't just spouting empty rhetoric. Navarro had actually seen his town in ashes 2 decades before, blood pooling in the streets, the heads of friends and relatives in iron cages strung up around the Plaza de Armas. And yet he, and most of the rest of the residents of Texas in 1834 and 35 and 36, weren't cowed by this memory. They seemed to be emboldened by it. And this time, instead of waiting for tyranny to march on them, they decided to take the fight to the tyrant. In early 1835, 48 San Antonians, under the command of 28-year-old Juan Seguin, defied the local centralist political chief and invited Santa Anna's wrath by marching on his newly appointed state government in Coahuila. Centralist reinforcements sent north by the new dictator soon overran Coahuila, however, and when Seguin's expeditionary force retreated back into Texas, centralist armies were now hot on their heels. Seguin rallied Texans of all backgrounds to the town of Gonzales, where a self-proclaimed Revolutionary Army of Texas came together and then marched on the centralist forces that had occupied San Antonio. In December of 1835, the centralists surrendered and were forced then to abandon the state. Tejanos knew that the fight wasn't over, however. When in February of 1836, Santa Anna himself crossed the Rio Grande, his army's officer ranks overflowed with former royalists. Men like Generals José de Urrea and Vicente Filisola, and some like Domingo Ugartechea, who had actually been with Santa Anna at the Battle of Medina. Tejanos would have immediately recalled the drumbeats of Arredondo's executioners. They knew, before anyone else, that the battle for Texas could only end in victory or death. I feel like the place where old San Antonio has held out the longest is along the Medina River, near the area of the Battle of Medina. Here, you're most likely to find land owned by descendants of the original grantees, Herrera, Ruiz, Lozoya, Martinez, Perez. Here, you'll find the plots laid out perpendicular to the river in old Spanish fashion. And here, you'll find land that's been farmed in recent memory by its owners, who congregated over the years in unincorporated communities like Lozoya, which to this day still resist annexation by the larger cities around them. Maybe it's a vestigial memory of the bloodshed near here that's kept outsiders away, or maybe it's the fact that the Medina marked a sort of no man's land, sitting at the historic boundary between Texas, Coahuila, and Tamaulipas. Whatever the reason, it is, frankly, where I feel most connected to the past that I've been rediscovering during this series. And the people who have supplied me information for this project are additional reminders of the continuous, unbroken connection that we have to our past in this part of the world. Our pilot from Episode 5, Alberto Musquiz, descending from one of the wing commanders from the Battle of Medina, Sergio Robles Gil Gutierrez, also from episode 5, passing me journals and diaries from his ancestor, Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara. The voice of this series, Joe Arciniega, reading for us the words of his forefathers who led Texas's first attempt at independence in the first bonus episode. Kathy Rodriguez Brown, descendant of the first Canary Islanders to settle San Antonio in 1731 and possessor of an iron ball that may or may not be a cannonball from the battle. And former Bexar County Historical Commissioner Fred Martinez, on whose family lands so much of the action of this battle may have occurred, and a man who is still to this day fighting as hard as any to make sure that his ancestors' sacrifices during this period won't be soon forgotten. I, on the other hand, feel like I'm failing this part of the world and failing all the people who have helped me on this journey by admitting to you now that I have not found definitive proof for the Battlefield of Medina. In a part of the state that has been plowed, disked, tilled, dug up for tanks, and prospected for oil, the absence of evidence for this battle is downright weird. It leads me to wonder if we're not still missing something big. Notwithstanding all this, I have my theories, and it would be a cop-out on my part not to publish them for you now. So on the Rivard Report webpage for this episode, I've posted a heat map highlighting what I believe to be the most likely area or areas where most of the fighting occurred during the Battle of Medina. And here's my methodology. I went and I mapped out all of the contemporary descriptions of the battlefield by those who came along after the battle, free of adrenaline and agendas. More specifically, I've overlain Stephen F. Austin's annotations on his maps with arcs indicating the distances mentioned by other observers. Pedro Walker's 7 to 8 miles, Navarro's 6 miles, Gaines's 6 miles, and Menchaca's 5 miles. And I've tried to see where these arcs overlap. I've also plotted on the same map the Las Gallinas Creek watershed, where Kathy Brown's artifact was found, and a 1-mile radius around El Carmen Church. There's clearly some cultural memory of something having happened around El Carmen, and if this project has taught us nothing else, it's the importance and credibility of cultural memory. In validation of this, I'll share with you one last surprise that former Bexar County Historical Commissioner Fred Martinez had for me. A photo from the San Antonio Light from May 9, 1937, featuring 3 respectable old daughters of the Republic of Texas standing around the original 1936 historical marker, at its original location, near El Carmen Church, in my lovely little hay farm. And so, taking it all together, I feel like the evidence suggests that the main clash of infantry and artillery during the Battle of Medina occurred somewhere in the vicinity of the Superior Silica Sand Mine on Old Pleasanton Road, where even today, Las Gallinas Creek pools in small little watering holes, charcos, as we would call them in South Texas. That's the red spot indicated on the map on the Rivard Report webpage. Maybe the yellow spot southwest of there is where Arredondo was perched, observing the battle, and where Menchaca and Ruiz, leading the mounted Tejanos, clashed with Royalist cavalry in their effort to kill the commanding general. Maybe the yellow spots to the northeast of that red spot represent the running slaughter, as Republicans fell back toward the future spot of El Carmen Church, where Arredondo would bury his dead that night. Maybe. Who really knows? And frankly, after studying this battle for so long now, I can't help but ask the question, why do we still care? What would finding the Medina battlefield even mean at this point? We know what happened on August 18th, 1813. I can see these brave men and women as clear as day, charging across the Medina River, weaving in and out of oak trees, dragging their cannons through the sand, hot, thirsty, disorganized, brown faces, red faces, white faces, indistinguishable beneath a sweat-streaked layer of black powder and dust, fighting side by side for something that was apparently more important than all the things that differentiated them. And of course, we know what happened afterward. 1,000 or so Republicans dead, hundreds of San Antonio men executed, dozens of San Antonio women assaulted and worse, and Texans so deeply traumatized that they would never really again trust any power emanating from anywhere outside their own borders. The events of 1810 to 1813 in Texas, which is to say the events covered in this series, prove nothing less than the fact that the notion of Texan apartness, of Texan uniqueness, is so much older than 1836. Indeed, the protagonists of 1836 inherited it from the heroes of 1813, and the heroes of 1813, frankly, inherited it from their ancestors, who had carved for themselves a place on the inhospitable Texas frontier through so much hardship. I don't know that you can find any clearer or nobler embodiments of Texan identity than men like Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara and Miguel Menchaca, or women like Josefa Arrocha and all the Tejanas who suffered defiantly the horrors of La Quinta. And we don't need a battlefield marker to honor these men and women. Indeed, I'd argue we shouldn't wait for one. We should make the effort every August 18th to recall their Noche Triste, a night which old San Antonians certainly never could forget. Something else I think that we should advocate for is that these same men and women should be restored to their proper place in Mexico's heroic pantheon. I'm not the first to argue this. Recall that the author of the anonymous memoir of the Sack of Bear upheld his account as an object lesson for all, quote, true Mexicans, end quote, encouraging them to listen to his tale and, quote, learn how to suffer for liberty and independence, end quote. What they suffered was indeed no less than what the communities of Guadalajara, Morelos, Zacatecas, Oaxaca, Puebla, Veracruz, and others did. Historically, however, the problem for most Mexicans in honoring the events of this series is that retroactively, Gutierrez de Lara's army and Texas's Declaration of Independence in 1813 feels like the vanguard of a later North American invasion of Mexico. But that's unfair to the men and women in 1813, whose primary goal, and chief accomplishment, I would argue, was to keep alive the flames of Father Miguel Hidalgo's revolt in the dark years between his death and the rise of the great revolutionary captains of central Mexico. How would history have been different if Arredondo's formidable regiment had remained in Veracruz, where it was supposed to be based, to face off against Guadalupe Victoria in 1815 or 1817? The War of Mexican Independence might have turned out very differently. Interestingly, San Antonians used to know their place in Mexico's history. Well into the 20th century, in fact, 16 de septiembre, September 16th, was actively celebrated in San Antonio. So much so that the president of Mexico in 1941 gifted San Antonians a statue of Father Miguel Hidalgo, which resides today in Romana Plaza across from the Central Library. Francisco Madero certainly knew San Antonio's place in Mexican history when he took up residence here in 1910 to write the Plan de San Luis Potosí, which led to the toppling of another autocrat a century later. San Antonio isn't just the cradle of Texas liberty, it's the cradle of Mexican liberty as well. And we don't need a Medina battle marker to remind us of that either. And yet, I do understand that at the end of the day, we as humans need a place to go to perform our rituals of remembrance. We believe that a place is invested with power because of the presence or even suffering of those who came there before us. It's why people spend thousands of dollars on grave sites and tombstones, and why something like 3 million people a year visit that tiny little humpbacked mission in downtown San Antonio. But with respect to the Battle of Medina, I've come to the conclusion that even if tomorrow we do find a concentration of munitions near someone's water tank on the Bear-Atascosa County line, that still may not be the best place for us to honor this battle. On July 13th, 2019, just a few weeks ago, I attended Mass at El Carmen Church at the invitation of Padre Pancho Puente. It was the feast day of Nuestra Señora del Carmen, the day each year when the parish honors the 200-year-old history of the church. The Archbishop was even in attendance. El Carmen Church, recall, is the site with the oldest claim to a connection to the Battle of Medina. It was, in fact, the first site that we mentioned in this entire podcast back in episode 1. Well, Fred Martinez also sent me the speech of the bishop in 1856, who inaugurated a new chapel there. In this speech, the bishop makes casual but conspicuous mention of a battle that was fought nearby, which since that time had apparently retained a connection to Nuestra Señora del Carmen, quote, whose image was blazoned upon the flag of the army by order of the general, end quote. Would you like to guess which saint General Joaquín de Arredondo took as his personal protector? I'll give you two hints. His son and daughter's names were Joaquín del Carmen and María del Carmen, born in 1817 and 1818, respectively, from which years we also have letters written by General Arredondo from a spot along the Medina River known as the Campamento de Nuestra Señora del Carmen. The Battlefield of Medina may have been forgotten, but the battle hasn't been. And El Carmen Church is the place where for over 200 years congregants have gathered to commemorate that battle. Ironically, it's over the graves of the Royalist dead that the descendants of many old Tejano Republicans have convened for 200 years to commemorate this battle. Yet that small irony seems almost appropriate, given the messiness of the events of 1813. El Carmen Church, under that interpretation, becomes the place that brought together victor and vanquished and forced them to accommodate some kind of workable solution, even if only in death. Which is all just to say that to the extent that we feel like we need a place to go to honor the Battle of Medina, I think we already have it. The victory of the Royalists at the Battle of Medina helped ensure that centralism would remain the prevailing political philosophy of the Mexican state. This is because Royalists never really lost the War of Mexican Independence. They eventually just reached an accommodation with a few of the principal rebel chiefs in central Mexico and agreed to join forces and lay down their arms together. But this is also why Mexico's independence, when finally achieved, was so unsatisfying to Mexican Republicans. Even after independence, many at the center of power in the Valley of Mexico doubted that truly democratic, federalist institutions could work in Mexico. Santa Anna, who was actually technically a federalist when he said this, probably spoke for more than a few power brokers in the capital when he said that, quote, 100 years from now, Mexicans still will not be fit for liberty, end quote, and that, quote, a despotism is the proper government for Mexico, end quote. Meanwhile, Joaquín de Arredondo's ethnic cleansing campaign in Texas, to use Donald Chipman and Harriet Joseph's term, had the unintended side effect of driving many of Texas's most prominent citizens to seek refuge in the United States of the North. There, their commercial and personal bonds with their neighbors to the east only grew stronger, while their experience living in the vibrant new country only reaffirmed their Republican convictions. When they were finally allowed to return to Texas in the 1820s, they brought with them a new vision for their province. They decided that they would make of Texas, in the words of Lorenzo de Zavala, quote, a combined regime of the American system and the Spanish customs and traditions, end quote, which would represent the triumph of the new world over the tired ideas of the old. Lorenzo de Zavala, incidentally, had actually been one of the principal architects of the Mexican Constitution of 1824, the Constitution that Santa Anna had just repudiated. And de Zavala would go on to become the first vice president of a truly independent Texas. Achieving that independence wouldn't be easy, however. Another great conflict still awaited Texans, and they carried into that fight all the trauma and lessons learned from the battles of the First Republic of Texas in 1813. 1 out of 3 Tejano men would take up arms in the Texas Revolution of 1835-36, compared to only 1 out of 7 Anglos, who lacked the same context for the fight. And yet Anglos too would be inspired by the example of 1813. Recalling perhaps the grave marker for those, quote, imitators of Leonidas, end quote, who fell at the Battle of Medina, a militia unit in Gonzales in 1835 would quote the same Spartan king and challenge their own tyrannical oppressor to, quote, come and take their weapons. And indeed, the final stand of 187 men at a crumbling old mission in San Antonio in March of 1836 would be immediately compared to the sacrifice of those same Spartans at Thermopylae. Yet at the time, the defeat of Texas Federalists at the Alamo gave Santa Anna and his generals every reason to believe that they were on course to replicate Arredondo's success from a generation before. Actually, as they made camp on the San Jacinto River on April 20th, 1836, they seemed poised to achieve what even the ruthless Arredondo had come up short on: the complete and total extermination of the dream of Texan self-government. The commander opposing these Centralists, however, also knew the story of 1813. General Sam Houston had made a point to remind his commanders not to be drawn out ahead of their lines, as had happened to Toledo at Medina. There were many in his ranks, however, who didn't need reminding. Get this, half of the known American survivors of the Battle of Medina had returned to Texas by 1836 and were living there as Mexican citizens. At least 2 sons of American veterans of the Battle of Medina stood now in Houston's ranks. And the senator from that Sabine district in the provisional Texas government was none other than Gutierrez de Lara's ever-reliable recruiter, James Gaines, who had just helped write his second Texas Declaration of Independence a month earlier. Yet there were 20 men in Houston's army that he definitely did not need to remind about 1813. These 20 men had the unique honor of having been present at almost every moment of the Texas Revolution of 1835-36. I'm talking, of course, about Juan Seguin's Ranging Battalion, who had been the first to rise up in arms against Santa Anna's usurpation of power. They had marched into Coahuila in March of 1835, helped rally Texans to Gonzales in October of that same year, stormed San Antonio in December, foraged, scouted, and fought at the Alamo in February and March of 1836, covered the runaway scrape the following April, and tracked Santa Anna's army all the way to where it had made camp now on the San Jacinto. And listen to this statistic. If my rudimentary genealogical research is correct, of the 20 men in Seguin's company, including himself, 17 of them had a direct family member on a list published by General Arredondo just after the Battle of Medina, listing the most prominent insurgents whose property he had ordered confiscated. And frankly, I just don't have enough info about the other 3 to know their family tree, though I can tell you that 2 of them were born in San Antonio in 1806, and so almost certainly had some kind of personal memories of 1813 as well. But there's more. At least 7 of Seguin's 20-man unit were direct descendants of members of Gutierrez de Lara's inner circle and ruling junta. So what's my point here? Seguin's unit wasn't just a casual collection of romantics who suddenly showed up on the banks of the San Jacinto. These were the most dyed-in-the-wool, long-suffering, pedigreed Republicans in Texas. Don't forget either that one of the highest-ranking Tejanos in the Republican Army of the North, José Francisco Ruiz, probably could have been leading Seguin's unit had he not been sent to represent San Antonio in the new provisional Texas government, where he had been the second man to sign the 1836 Texas Declaration of Independence. All of which is to say that for the men of Juan Seguin's company, the Battle of San Jacinto on April 21st, 1836, wasn't a new fight against a new foe. It was a revenge match. Like the parishioners at El Carmen Church, the men in Seguin's unit had never forgotten what had happened in 1813. Each of them could list friends and loved ones who had suffered and died during that tragic year. If the rest of Mexico would never quite have the opportunity to redeem the tragedies of the War of Mexican Independence, these 20 Tejanos, on this day at least, would. Thank you for listening. This concludes our series, Finding Medina. I hope you've enjoyed it. And hey, if you think these events are important, please go on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review. The only compensation we get for doing this work is the feedback that we hear from listeners, so I'd greatly appreciate it if you took the time to tell us what you thought. As always, too, go check out the webpage associated with this episode on the Rivard Report, where you can see my final best guess heat map for where I think the Battle of Medina occurred. Feel free to comment on it, or heck, use it as inspiration to start searching for the battle yourself. If you do go search, please make a point to pass by El Carmen Church and say a prayer and maybe leave $1 or $2 in their donation box. They've been keeping the memory of these events alive longer than anyone, and I feel like we owe it to them to support them. I've included a link to their parish webpage on the Rivard Report as well. And I've also included a link to elgritosanantonio.org. El Grito San Antonio is a joint effort organized by the San Antonio, Mexico Friendship Council, the local Mexican Consulate, the City of San Antonio International Relations Department, and the Cortez family of Mi Tierra's fame to revive the tradition of the Grito every 16 de septiembre in San Antonio. I hope, after listening to this series, that we can all now appreciate a little more how the 16 de septiembre is an event in San Antonio's history, not just Mexico's, that deserves to be celebrated and remembered. Oh, and a quick teaser. We'll be back in a few months for Season 3 of A New History of Old Texas, dedicated entirely to the journeys of Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, the 16th century Spanish conquistador turned slave, turned traveling salesman, turned faith healer, turned prophet, who after 9 years wandering naked in the Texas and northern Mexican wilderness, returned to Spanish society, leading an entourage of hundreds, if not thousands of people behind him. What sustained this man and his colleagues on this incredible journey? And what might the wanderings of a few shipwrecked Spaniards nearly 500 years ago still be able to teach us today? Join us to find out on the next season of A New History of Old Texas. Editing for this episode was performed by my lovely wife, Susana Canseco. Sound engineering by Stephen Bennett. A special thanks to my friend George Gaitan for letting us use his music on this series. You can find out more about him at georgegaitan.tripod.com. Thanks one last time to my SWCA research buddies, Crystal Allgood, Rob Lackowitz, and Zachary Overfield, as well as to former San Antonio City archaeologist Kay Hines. Thanks to my friend and former Bexar County Historical Commissioner Fred Martinez, who I feel like I've mentioned in almost every episode. I posted a picture of us together in front of El Carmen Church on the episode webpage. And thanks to Brian Stauffer, our unofficial Old Spanish document transcriber, to Samantha Alanis, our cartographer-in-chief, to Cesar Gutierrez, our unofficial Archivo General de la Nación researcher, and to UTSA's Dean of Libraries, Dean Hendricks, our all-other document finder. And for more information about our podcast and other projects, check out www.brandonseale.com.